I'm Kieran Garlick from the Advancement Book Club, and I'm here today with Anthony Tasgal, author of the Insight book, Taz. So we're going to talk with Taz about his book and his journey as an author, and a speaker, and a trainer.
And a lecturer.
Taz, your book, the Insight book, was just out. That's very much based in kind of advertising world. So can you tell us a little bit about your background in advertising and how that got you to writing a book?
Yeah, I started working in ad agencies. It was my first job. And I worked as what's called an account planner, so it's like a strategist, which was a bit of an odd leap because before that I'd spent 4 years doing Latin, Greek and ancient history. But ended up in advertising. And what I liked about it was the fact that I was working, as you say, with ads, but also with branding and marketing and government stuff and big companies like Peugeot or Cadbury. And I was trying to get people to either buy products or change their opinions about particular things. And I found it really fascinating because it's almost like a sort of psychology lab working in advertising. And I like working with creative people because they're all, but I also like helping get clients to sort of turn their challenges into something sort of real. So I did that and came across this thing called insight, which became, we need insight for our brand. We need insight to reposition or reframe our brand. Or we need an insight to help win the pitch for an agency against another agency. So all those things began to sort of percolate, as well as understanding how to tell good stories. And I did that for a few years and then got to an age where I thought probably I'm getting too old to work in advertising because the average age people in advertising is 12. So I sort of thought, okay, I wanted to branch out and do some training and do some lecturing and maybe sort of start writing books. So that's how that all began and went on for quite a few years.
So you were in advertising, but you talk about insight. So was insight a speciality of yours, or how's that work?
Yeah, because in the ad industry world, the way that different functions work is that creative people, their end product is very clear. They come up with the ideas, the ads, and everyone applauds them and they get lots of money. Account managers, account directors, their role is generally to stand there and pour water. But as a planner, your end product, it's slightly more intangible because you're coming up with a creative strategy or a creative brief, which you give creative people to work with. But it occurred to me that the nearest thing we have to an end product as planners is an insight. So if you can give a client or creative team or the agency an insight that says this will change your brand or this will help your agency win a pitch, that's probably as good as we can get. So rather than just going into meetings, actually can we come up with a great insight? So I always thought, okay, that's the thing I'm aiming at, whatever it is I'm trying to produce. If I can produce an insight, that's pretty much, I think, what I should be being paid for.
So clearly the background of this is advertising, but the book feels like it's broader than advertising. So was that a conscious thing? Did you want it to be about advertising, or was there a kind of, what were you hoping the impact would be of the book?
No, you're right. I mean, I sort of focused on the ad world and also the marketing and branding world because it's where I come from. But the more I thought about insight, the more I realised actually it's a very, very broad topic. And there's a whole section in the book about actually other people, other than market researchers, who have now tended to sort of colonise insight and think, okay, we have all the data. So market researchers or data analysts or data squirrels, as I like to call them sometimes, they've almost colonised it and say, our insight is ours because we have data. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to say, no, insight isn't just about, as I say, staring long and longingly at data. It's a much more creative exercise. So part of what I was trying to do was take it out of this niche which says it's only market research people or insight people or even ad industry people who have the right to talk about insight. Because a lot of the book I've researched all sorts of creative people, artists, writers, thinkers and scientists. So if you said to either Isaac Newton or Leonardo, insight began in the market research industry in 1980, I think they probably think it didn't. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is spread it out and to bring it to other areas, for example, even in schools and education.
Talking of schools and education, we were talking earlier about young people. Sorry, let me backtrack. We've just come out of COVID. The world has changed. And a lot of your book talks about how insight can often be accidental, perhaps. how you talk about serendipitous.
External serendipitous influences.
There you go. And with COVID now, perhaps young people especially will not have those same kind of experiences in the workplace or in school, working from home and studying at home. So what kind of impact do you think that will have on the workplace, on insight?
I'm going to metaphorically roll my sleeves up now because this is like one of my rants, really. So I do an awful lot of training, not just storytelling and behavioural economics and insight. And as you say, I wrote that last section during COVID, and COVID affected me and my view of insight as a practitioner, as a writer, and also as a parent. And all those things came together because one of the things that I say at the end of the book is how do you become better as an individual, at talking about and discovering insight. But also, how do companies create cultures that generate insight? Because again, whether you're a client in marketing or branding, whether you're, in any other creative area, you want to create insight. That's what you're trying to do. So Pixar famously, their offices were designed so that everyone had to go through a central lobby to get to their offices, so everyone would literally bump into each other. So this thing, as I say, ESI is external serendipitous influences. There's an awful lot in the book about how insight is about creating collisions and combinations. So my behavioural economics training, we talk about the unconscious system 1. So at an individual level, our brain makes ideas collide unconsciously. And in the business, this is called the 3 Bs: bed, bath and bus. Right? And everyone knows that you can go to bed and you can't, and then in the morning suddenly the answer comes to you, or you're in the bath. Famously, Archimedes, Eureka in the bath. So a lot of what I'm saying in the book is how do we do it as individuals? Right, we need to read more and go out and bump into people, whatever. But how do companies do that? So companies at a collective level have to get as many of their people to come in, speak to each other, bump into each other over a cup of coffee or at the water cooler or in the lift, and say, what are you doing, what are you reading, what are you... And then those ideas will percolate and they'll become, either within individuals or groups, they will become the basis of insight. So what I was trying to say as we were coming out of COVID was, and you had Jacob Rees-Mogg shouting at people in the civil service and everything, but what I was trying to say was companies, if they want to create a culture of insight, they need to get more of their staff back in more often to bump into each other so that those incidental collisions will create things later down the line. So I'm quite forceful about companies saying, I know why it's in your interest, and I absolutely know why lots of people, whether they are introverted or whether they have issues, they want to work from it. I absolutely understand that. But at a company level, it's a really good idea to try and get people back so that they can create that sense of insight.
So, like you said, that's at a company level. At an individual level, is there anything that people can do, at an individual level to be more insightful?
Yeah, there's a few.
Whether that's at work or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I've got the last section. There's 3 things. There's characteristics, credos, and culture. So there's a few sort of credos that I've given. So one of my credos is information is to be collected, but insight is to be connected. So insight is always about trying to make as many new connections as you can. So, do read, do go outside your area. So one of the things I talk about, and again it goes back to my ad industry days, is often people work in one sector or in one market or in one brand. So I've just come off a call with a client, and they're a charity and they work in one particular sort of sphere. Or I used to work with Cadbury, chocolate, or Specsavers, Vision. And the danger with that area is if all you do is see people as people who need eye tests or people who consume chocolate, it's very hard to come up with insight. So I always say to people, you've got to have one foot in your market, in your world, but one foot outside. So an awful lot I'm saying is about being... Can I do a bit of etymology? All right for a bit?
Yeah, go on.
I mentioned I used to do classics, so I'm obsessed with etymology, where words come from. So there's a word, we talk about error, right? So error is generally not considered to be a good thing. But if you go back to the origin of that word, errare in Latin means to wander. which is why we talk about erratic behaviour. If you're driving erratically, you're wandering across the road. So I always say to people, error is not making a mistake, it's wandering. So again, one of the things I'll say to people, if you want to be more insightful, is allow yourself to wander. You'll make mistakes, you'll do, but if you wander outside of your specific area of expertise or competency, it's more likely, someone described it like you're at risk of coming up with good ideas. And again, that's one of the things that I talk about. I talk about the power of being a good storyteller. And I would say that, wouldn't I? Because my first book and the fourth book, which was a sequel, all about storytelling. I think a good insight is about telling stories. So you can find the insight, but how you share that insight and how you make people listen to that insight is the other half of the story. And often people don't get that right. I've come up with an insight, but how are you going to get the CEO, how are you going to get people to listen to it and put it into practice? And another area that I'm fascinated by, and it's probably a topic in itself, is wit. I'm obsessed with humour, how humour works. And I often think that humour and insight are very similar. So an insight is like a punchline. So two fish in a tank, one says to the other, how do you drive this thing? Insert laughter. And the point is, that's what insight takes you somewhere, and then at the end you go, oh, okay. Because there's a quote I use from Isaac Asimov, who's a scientist, a science fiction writer, who many people know. He wrote I, Robot and Foundation and Empire. And he had this great saying as an interviewee and a scientist. He says, when scientists come up with something new, they don't shout eureka. They go, that's funny. And I've always thought that's one of the best definitions I've heard of insight. He's not actually using it, but I think it's a great, that's funny. And humour does that, because funny has two meanings. But also, when you're looking at something, it makes you stop and think, oh, hang on, that's funny, I hadn't thought of it. That means you're probably on the right trail for an insight. So
we talked, or your book rather, talks a lot about insight and the kind of, I don't know, whimsical nature, I suppose, of insight, but you also have in here some kind of tangible, you have a murder board. Tell us about the murder board.
Yeah, I'm really aiming for like the detective Richard Osman crossover here. No, seriously, the point about it was I just thought, there are lots of, I'm a person who likes words, I'm not very visual, but I do like my words, the etymology and stuff. So there's like a mood board or a word cloud of words like storyteller and wanderer, almost. But I thought, is there anything vaguely visual I could put in the book? And then it occurred to me, because I do watch an awful lot of Scandinavian and non-Scandinavian detective programs, and I thought actually that murder board, which I think is the technical term for it, which is a bit like here really, where you see the detectives and they're all sitting around the room, and there's like bits of thread and there's arrows talking about where the murder. And I actually thought, that's not a bad analogy for how insight works in the brain. So you've got all sorts of things colliding and buffeting all over, which don't seem necessarily to be connected, except where your brain unconsciously goes, actually there's a thread between that and that. So in the same way that they're looking for like a modus operandi or a killer, your brain is trying to make also connections that link things. So one of the things, again, in the book, I'm a huge film fan, which I don't think I've talked enough about. So there are a couple of film references in there. So Suzanne Collins famously said that she was just scrolling through TV stations, one evening, and there was a program about war. I think it was Afghanistan or Iraq, and she was watching all this horror, and then she just happened to channel hop, and the next one was a reality show, and she thought, what would happen if you put those things together? And then she wrote Hunger Games. And Charlie Kaufman was saying, I had two great ideas. It was about somebody living inside someone's head, and the idea of two colleagues at work having an affair. And he said the ideas didn't go anywhere, but I put them together and it became Being John Malkovich. So this idea about ideas at random, but if you can link them up, something new comes. That's one of my ways of demonstrating insight. So I thought I'd show the picture of the murder board, again, as just a visual metaphor for that idea.
Let's backtrack a little bit. So another thing that I'm quite interested in as members of a book club is what made you write the book, and beyond obviously your interest in insight or storytelling, So what made you want to write a book, and how did you find that process? What did you get from it? What were the challenges?
It's 8 years now since the first book came out, and I'd always wanted to write a book. I've always loved books. I am a person who grew up with, not when I was very young because it was Marvel comics, but got into books and, as I say, Latin and Greek. And I've always thought I'd really like to write a book. And then about 8 years ago, I was doing all this training on storytelling and thought, I've got enough material here, I could probably write something. So I wrote 75,000 words on storytelling and had a contract with a publisher. And they said, Rick, you really like this, we're going to publish it. And I was thinking, yeah. And then I got an email from the editor, a guy called Martin, saying, I'm leaving Hong Kong, which is where he was based, coming back to London, but don't worry, everything will be fine. Now, as you know, there are certain sentences or phrases in English which mean the opposite of what they seem to say.
Everything will be fine.
Everything will be fine means no. Like, with all due respect means I don't care what you think. So about 2 weeks later, I got an email from the publisher, his boss, saying, we've changed our mind. We're not going to publish it. No reason, just not going to publish it. So I live in North London, so every person you bump into is a lawyer. And I said, well, I've got a contract. I said, yeah, it's just not really worth. So I got a bit fed up, a bit miserable. And then 6 months later, a year later, Martin turned up in London. He said, come out and have an Earl Grey tea, which is my tipple. And we had a chat and he said, look, I work for this company called Lid, and they do these Concise Advice, thin moleskin-sized books. If you can cut it down from 75,000 to 28,000, I'll publish it. So I had this really difficult choice, which is I really wanted to be published and be in a bookshop, but I also didn't want to lose 47,000 of my favourite words. So I did that in the end. Obviously, spoiler alert, the book's there. But the thing was, I'd always wanted to write it. And I've said, people keep asking me about how do you write a book. I often think, actually, if there's something that annoys you, or something you think isn't right, So the first book, I've talked a bit about the insight, but the first book was, as I hinted before, lots of people present really badly. Lots of people write really boring presentations. Lots of websites are dull. Lots of advertising is dull. So I thought, actually, why? And it's because we've created this system I call arithmocracy, the obsession with numbers and metrics and KPIs. And we've lost the art of storytelling. So that was it. That was my sort of like elevator pitch to myself. And that got me sufficiently annoyed to sort of turn it into a book. And most of the books I've written now are based on something that I find annoying or irritating, or I really want to sort of just vent. And yeah, that's pretty much how it's worked. And
so just finally, what is the next thing for you as a speaker, as an author? Are you going to re-release this book with 75,000 words?
No, there was a sequel to it. Edition. Funny enough, there's one thing that gives the book away in terms of being written in. Well, it came out in 2015, so I wrote it in 2014. There's a bit where I rant about brand names or ideas that get merged. Because I say it's very simple. You have to keep things simple and distinct. Don't blend things together. So I give some examples in the book of Jedward, which obviously people will remember as a very topical reference. But the other thing I wrote about, and people still write to me on LinkedIn or whatever and say, the thing that gives it away is I talked about a particular political, geographical issue that was going on about a country that was thinking of leaving the European Union. And it was Grexit. Because Brexit wasn't really a thing.
Right.
And it was Greece. If you remember, Greece had this fun. So people say to me, that's the only thing that I think would change, because there's a paperback edition coming out soon. But the next book, I mentioned the 3 areas I'm interested: storytelling, insight, and behavioural economics. So I'm going to do a book. I'm writing it now. I haven't quite agreed the title yet with my author, with publisher or myself. But it's going to be about behavioural economics, which is nudge theory, Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast and slow. And a wonderful quote from a man called David Eagleman: we don't think the way we think we think. So what I'm again looking at is why we get it so wrong in terms of understanding how people make decisions, whether it's buying products or choosing services or voting for political parties.
I was going to say, will that have an anchor in advertising world as well?
It will come from the advertising, but I again want to make it broader, because one of the biggest groups that's taken behavioural economics and run with it is government. So Thaler and Sunstein, who wrote Nudge, they were from Chicago, and one of the up-and-coming politicians that they got quite chummy with in Chicago was a man called Barack Obama. So he brought them into the White House. Funny enough, one of the first things that Donald Trump did was take out all of the behavioural nudge team out of the White House. I know that because I did some work with Google, and Google told me that they just bought them. Google just said, okay, we'll buy them, we'll take them. So I want to talk about that, how it works at government level, how it works for advertising, but again in terms of other decisions that we make, whether it's in terms of our partners, our homes, our family, whatever. So I'm going to look at how, again, behavioural economics and influence actually works, rather than how companies like to think that it might work.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I look forward to reading the next book, and maybe talk to you again then.
Good, thanks a lot, Kieran.
Thank you very much.
Bye.